You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius podcast. My guest is Mitchell Neubert. He's at Baylor University. He's a Senior Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Development. He holds the Chavon Chair in Christian Ethics and Business. He's a professor of management. And we're going to talk about the topic of the role Christianity plays in business. So, Mitchell, welcome and thanks for coming.
Great, my pleasure.
Yeah, tell me a bit about your history and then how you got onto this topic and, to where you're at today.
Sure. Well, I'm at Baylor University, which for those who aren't familiar, is an institution that has a mission statement that involves Christian values and beliefs. And so it's in a unique situation in academia where we haven't really abandoned that for the sake of research aspirations or other things. That seems to be the path that some universities have taken. We've tried to hold that firm as something that's essentially what we do while we have advanced our research to an R1 status. And so we're unique in that aspect. And as a result, that creates a unique space for me to feel free to think about how my faith, which is very central to me and has been for a large portion of my life, might play out in my teaching and in my research. And so that probably gives me the freedom more than other people who can't really have those conversations with colleagues in the halls, about how faith might impact those things. But we can here at Baylor, and that's a real blessing.
Oh, it's received in an okay way. It's not vilified or anything.
No. In fact, I lead some seminars here where we talk about how that's a strategic, a distinctive of ours to actually be able to bring the whole person into the classroom, the whole person in discussions about research. And I was trained at a regular university, a Big Ten research institution, University of Iowa. And certainly there, it wasn't popular to talk about spiritual things. And I think most professors are socialized to keep that out of their conversations. It's a bit taboo to think about spiritual aspects of people's lives. But the reason why I think it's an advantage for those who do think about that is that does explain, I think, a huge, sometimes most significant part of why we do things, what drives us, what our motivations are, how maybe we withstand difficult situations, why we're resilient or not. And so I think we have actually a opening there as a researcher in particular to understand really what's happening when we measure and assess what's happening in behavioral science, for example, by actually including spiritual variables and thinking about how that might be the explanation that other people aren't looking for.
Well, what does that mean? What's an example of the spiritual variables that you would consider that most people wouldn't?
Sure. Well, one example that a colleague and I worked on, he had initiated this project of trying to gain some information about what explained the success of microfinance entrepreneurs. Those folks who get small loans, particularly in developing countries. In this case, we are in Kenya and Indonesia, working with some groups there. We were trying to understand what makes them successful, because obviously that's our hope, is that they would use that money and help themselves, out of poverty. But so we had the kind of standard questions that related to how much money they were going to receive, what was their social network, what was their, and we categorized each of this as a kind of capital. So a financial capital, a social capital, a human capital around their education or training, even a psychological capital about their personality or level of optimism. So we had a number of these factors or variables in research were described that we expected would explain part of the success of these microfinance entrepreneurs to sell their products, to be innovative, and then also to attract and retain employees. And what we found out is we had actually another variable that we put in there called spiritual capital, which really was a measure of faith centrality or faith maturity, like how important was their relationship with God? Did they consider God to be present in their work? That was kind of a vertical set of questions. And then there also was a horizontal set of questions about, does your faith impact how you treat other people? Does your faith motivate you to do certain behaviors that are pro-social? Anyways, this measure of spiritual capital, after we accounted for the financial capital, the human capital, the social capital, the psychological capital, spiritual capital still predicted or added to our variance explained. That's kind of your research lingo there. But and we were the ones who included that, or other studies would have left that out. And actually, it after all those things were controlled, it still was a significant predictor of those important variables about how many, their sales, their people that work with them, and also how innovative they were. So, I mean, that's an example of just adding that extra element that maybe somebody else wouldn't add, and we explain more of a phenomena that we're interested in their understanding.
Well, what does that mean? Like the people that were of faith, they did better with the loans, they paid them back more often? Like what specific metrics did you evaluate?
Yeah, those three metrics were those ideas of like what were their sales, and those were kind of standardized, related, to what they were selling. I mean, in other products they standardized this kind of was a measure of sales, a measure of like how often they kind of changed their product, or how many different kinds of products they sold. These typical, these were microfinance folks who were running vegetable stands or things that were relatively straight and simple, but also like how many people they employed to maybe sell the vegetables or go get the fresh water or sell the soda or pop that they were selling, So we were looking at those kinds of performance metrics, sales, innovations, and number of people that work with them. Certainly the company had, some data about paybacks, but we didn't actually look at that one. So, and I'm sure they did, because that's important to keep the money coming back in so you can fund more. But that wasn't the focus of our study.
So what other situations do you want to include these factors to see how much of a role they play?
I think you can look at a number of different areas and ask yourself, well, would we understand this better if we accounted for somebody's spiritual life or how central it is? And let me say one thing, that it's not new for a study to maybe capture religious tradition or religious background. And that can explain some things, but actually it can be disappointing as well, because, for example, there was a research stream for a while in ethics that basically said, well, we added in these religious variables, but it didn't seem to explain that people were acting more ethically and, in face of different decisions or challenges. But then what I think taking a closer look at how they measured, faith or religion, they realized just saying that you're part of a denomination or a religion, just affiliation, isn't significant. You actually have to be engaged in that, right? It has to be central to your life. So we started, researchers, not just myself, but researchers over time have tried to focus more on like how important it is to you or how salient it is, instead of just where you're affiliated, because the affiliation doesn't seem to predict much, but in some cases it does, but it doesn't predict as much as you hope. But when you actually get down to centrality, how important it is to somebody, then you can predict if they're going to, again, resist temptations, if they're going to be persevering in difficult situations, like you might expect or you might propose. If they have a strong faith, they might be able to draw on those resources of ethics and spiritual resources to actually, do the right thing at the workplace and persevere through difficult, circumstances. So that's one thing, comes to mind as we're doing this, is it's adding the right variable, not just adding like an affiliation variable. Another example from my research was just understanding why people would be committed to an organization. And, if your job's not very satisfying, typically that's a strong predictor of not being committed to the organization. You want to look around and leave. But what we found is that those who felt spiritually called, who felt like God was with them in their work, and that God had, compelled them, or they felt accountable to God in doing their work, that they would be committed to the organization even when their jobs weren't very satisfying. So that helped us understand, when does job satisfaction, not relate to commitment. If you consider somebody's faith affiliation, not affiliation, but their centrality of their faith, you find out that actually that might help explain who will persist through a difficult situation, whereas maybe somebody else might not.
Do you have specifics of this, or is this new that you're going to be looking at things this way, but you haven't yet?
Oh, there was a study that we published in a Journal of Business Ethics where it showed this interaction that those with spiritual calling, it would persist even when they had like lower levels. I mean, they would, be committed to the organization even when they had lower levels of job satisfaction. Now, that doesn't mean that terrible job, a person with faith is not going to quit. No, it's just saying overall, if we work in behavioral science and kind of probabilities, they'd be more likely, to stay and stick it out, is what the results would suggest.
But how much more? Or a lot?
That's a good question. How much would they put up with? We didn't measure that. Maybe that's the next study, is not if they're, how long and what kinds of things would they persevere through, and who would persevere through them more than others. I think, there's a lot of research now in related to resiliency, right? Bouncing back from things or persisting.
Actually, sorry, one thing comes to mind is that actually may have the opposite effect. If a person of strong Christian faith is in a job that they feel is contradictory to Christian values, they'd be more likely to leave it, I would think, if things aren't going well, because they're like, not only am I doing this job that I really don't agree with, but it's not getting better, it's getting worse, and I really don't like it, and again, it goes against my beliefs. So I just don't want to do it anymore. So maybe you'd have the opposite effect in some cases.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. Of course, we were just asking about their job satisfaction, about their commitment to the organization. And we do know from the organizational commitment literature that, value fit is a huge thing. So, yeah, I think you're right. I mean, if we ask some other questions in that study about, how do your Christian values fit with the values of the organization, I mean, that too would predict, right? But in the opposite way, meaning if it's a misfit, then they'd be more likely to leave. But in this particular case, we were just kind of focused on this issue of your job itself, not necessarily the organizational values. But yeah, no, you're right. I mean, it could go the other way. And faith doesn't always win the day in terms of always being positive, right? It certainly at certain times, could relate to something where, an organization might, hesitate to promote faith or a faith-friendly, environment.
Right. Are you going to be continuing with the study in different areas? Or what's next for these types of questions? Where do you want to go with it?
Sure. Well, we did some initial work on this in entrepreneurs, and we're still kind of trying to extend that. So there's some research that my graduate student here, a graduate student that I worked with, who's working in this space, we're trying to connect entrepreneurs and their kind of well-being, and if their faith actually allows them to cope through difficult things, because this is another one of those areas where faith could maybe have an impact on difficult, challenging, let's say uncertain environments, which are common for entrepreneurs, right? Could they have their religious kind of coping, resources to actually persist? And it does seem like in our initial study in this space that does turn out to be true, right? That they'll continue on because they have these extra resources. So in fact, there's actually a colleague of mine, David Baylor, who's at Princeton, and he does work in this space and works with organizations and kind of navigating them through this space. And early on, he did a study where he kind of a sociological review of all the different ways that faith was integrated into work. And he came up with 4 areas. One is ethics. And I've certainly done some things in that space, trying to figure out how ethics impact the workplace, and particularly maybe Christians who have ethical principles and how that impacts the workplace. Another place is enrichment, meaning that you're a person's faith. And of course, we're talking about, in some cases, we're not talking just about Christianity. We're talking about faith traditions, sometimes broadly, but certain studies, we just primarily had Christians we were dealing with. But this relates to Christians, but it does map onto some other kind of religion as well. But ethics is one thing that religion seems to help us kind of manifest different ethics. And we've done some work in there. Enrichment, where you actually have extra resources you feel like they're kind of help you in the workplace. And that could be just the sense of God being with you and being able to cope and persist, maybe wisdom, maybe other things that you feel like you bring to the table because your faith background, maybe the support of people behind you, they're, supporting and praying for you. But that's the second one. So ethics and enrichment is another way that people integrate. The third one is more of a expression, like people integrate their faith by speaking about it in the workplace or wearing certain things that, demonstrating it. We find out that one actually leads to a little bit more pushback in the workplace, that people are less comfortable with that. And organizations, I think there's a need for more research to figure out when and how can we encourage different expressions of faith, and when does it actually become counterproductive for the organization to support those. So that's an area of research that I haven't done much research in. We initially have found that people who have high levels of faith integration around expression do have higher levels of perceived discrimination. So there might be a little backlash there if you try to bring your faith into the workplace and sharing with others about what's important to you, or wearing, certain clothes that signify your faith. And then the last one is the one I talked about with calling. It's called experience. So each one of these 4 areas historically kind of these movements of faith integration kind of fit in these 4 areas. And that last one I'll explain a little bit more. That's more like that calling. Like faith might help you to experience your workplaces differently, or it's more meaningful. You feel like God's called you to it. For those of us that adhere to a kind of a Judeo-Christian tradition, we believe that God has given us a mandate from the beginning of time to be involved in helping the world flourish, and helping manage and cultivate and the earth and all of its inhabitants, right? So if you feel like God's called you to do something, and business is part of that, I mean, that can change your experience of maybe even the mundane routine. So I did a little research in that calling space, and that's probably a space I'd like to explore a little bit more, with what else does it impact when you feel called, or you feel like you have a mandate from God to do well and to be excellent in the workplace.
Have you interviewed people that have said that's why you're there in their given profession?
Absolutely. Yeah. One of these ways back, some colleagues and I from sociology, we Kevin Doherty and Jerry Park, we received a National Science Foundation in this area where we were trying to figure out how faith might impact work and specifically entrepreneurial like endeavors. And so we spent a lot of time in that space, trying to figure out to what extent it does impact those areas. And so, that, I think your specific question, maybe I just forgot when I was talking about that grant, but we did do some interviews. That's what I was thinking of. We did do some interviews as part of that. So it wasn't just survey research, which is some of the work I do. But in this case, we went out into different parts of the U.S. based on our initial survey work. We tracked down places where people said that their churches or congregations were helping them integrate their faith into work. And then I went out to New Jersey and interviewed some kind of traditional mainline churches, some that were really strong in this faith integration, and then another one that wasn't. And then another colleague went up to Michigan and interviewed some evangelicals, and then another church that was evangelical but didn't have that same emphasis. We went into Black churches, we went into Korean churches, we went into Catholic churches. And in those interviews, so I have all this data, right, where we interview people and actually kind of ask them, like, what does it mean? Or how does your faith work its way out? And we thought maybe we'd find another E or another dimension, but they seem to all fall in those areas that either shape their ethics, like their work ethic. They're also with their ethics of what's right and wrong and what they would not do at work. Change their experience at work, or even maybe what kinds of work they chose to do, right? Perhaps those, not everyone had the same choice, but right, they might have made a choice to kind of have a job that interacted more with people or had a direct way to serve people because of their faith. And then we found the other ones as well. And there we found that people were also feeling like they drew strength from their faith affiliation, and also felt like it's also a place where they might be able to share with other people and maybe, again, be a witness of sorts to other people around them. So we found those in those interviews. So yeah, people testified how that was really important to them to bring their faith in the workplace, and it made a difference for them.
I don't know, like in your work, do you feel like you were called? Maybe you might be a good example of some of your feelings and thoughts about it would be the start of a study on it.
Yeah, I think that's part, actually, I think good research is often kind of autobiographical, right? It comes out of questions you face. So I'm a leadership and ethics researcher, and part of that is having observed some good leaders and some bad leaders and trying to figure out what's the difference, right? But my faith research is driven by the fact that I do feel like, because of a relationship with God that I started kind of my teens with Jesus Christ, has made a positive impact on me and has shaped what I wanted to do. And so, yeah, it shaped where I wanted to be in a position where I could try to build into other people's lives and help equip them to be, effective professionals. And so that is certainly that idea of a calling. It really was part of moving me to Baylor, even though I kind of grew up in the Midwest, coming down all the way down to Texas to be a part of this grand experiment of maintaining our Christian mission, but also being excellent at research and teaching was unique. And so I came down here, felt called to be a part of this. It wasn't some kind of mysterious call, like, God appeared to me in a shiny light or spoke words to me in the dark. I mean, that might be part of some people's calling, but mine was just a strong kind of confidence after, praying about it, thinking about it, consulting with wise people that I knew that this was a place where I could be effective in building into young people's lives. And hopefully I've done a bit of that while I've been here. So I've been here over 20 years.
Oh, wow. Okay. I don't know. Do people bring faith to work mentally even? Or do a lot of people, they live two lives, one at work with work stuff and, at home or at church, then they let the faith out. But otherwise it doesn't really come into play during the day.
Right. There's kind of a long kind of philosophical discussion about that, about if actually, kind of a two spheres approach, like we have different spheres and at least two of those might be faith and work. There might be others, family and recreation or whatever, and whether all those things intersect or overlap. And for a while at Baylor and probably other schools, even those who are faith friendly said, well, that's fine. We can have, student activities that are fun or, that involve faith, but let's not integrate it too much into the classroom. But Baylor really a ways back, several kind of decades back, and maybe I'm even short selling them here, but decided that, hey, you know what? We don't see that really as the scriptural biblical story about how someone lives out their faith. It's not like you live one way on Sunday and another one on Monday. You actually should be the same person across all those spheres. And though certainly they don't completely overlap, there should be a significant overlap. And so we actually try to work that here, because I think there's a pull, and even our society, trying to separate the secular and the sacred division of, church and state, a number of these things that kind of seem to pull us away from that. But we think it's actually, again, a very good thing to think about how you could be a person. And I'll define this specifically, and it might be different than other people might define it. But to be a person of integrity would be a person who's integrated, right? Who is the same on Monday as they are on Sunday. And so we try to encourage that by people actually not dictating what their values should be, but helping them think through those things and thinking about then, okay, how can, those important values on Sunday work their way out on Monday? But I don't think it's a natural process just because like I said, everything's kind of seems like several things are pulling us away from that. But I think when we do, and in my own experience and the students I've worked with and friends, when we do integrate, there's a satisfaction in knowing that right, we're the authentic person, we're the same person, and we don't have these kind of double or dual lives. So, and I think another thing I thought of is this does provide inspiration. And again, it's one of these things we already talked about, like resources for my work life. And so to separate them actually would put me at a disadvantage. Having them connected is a blessing. Some of my best research ideas have probably come out of reflecting on my faith. For example, this is a little more implicit, though the topic itself might jump out to some who have a kind of religious background, but some of my research on leadership is around servant leadership. All right. And I saw that first for me. I saw that in the scriptures and the model of Christ. And I thought to myself, I wonder if that'll work in the business world. Is it going to transfer over? And being a researcher, I decided to test it. And so I was one of a group of folks, and there's several others involved, but where we started researching this about 2 decades ago. And now there's, I think, almost over 500. I think I'm short selling that as well. Studies around servant leadership and its impact in the workplace. And servant leadership is certainly a unique kind of leadership that can be informed by our faith. It doesn't have to be. But boy, the results are just crystal clear that when there's a servant leader who looks out for other people's interests, who's concerned about their growth, who gives them a voice and treats them as a partner, not just somebody that reports to them, that people respond well, right? They're more committed, they're more creative, they work harder, their teams function at a higher level. And so, that is kind of an example that kind of takes us back to the beginning about how I've been doing research in this area. But I think it comes out of the fact that something in my faith spurred me to think about an idea, leadership, servant leadership. Then I put it kind of into practice through research and then saw practitioners also doing it and was able to confirm that that's a great way to lead.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, as you and maybe other people you've spoken to are doing their work, are they checking in with their faith? Are they checking in with, for instance, Holy Spirit? Should I be working on this? How should I respond to this situation? What questions should I be asking, et cetera? Like, is there a lot of back and forth like that? Or is it, again, like people have their faith, but their job's their job and it's separate, even though maybe they're thinking about this stuff during the day, they're still acting in their job in a totally secular way.
You're right. I think actually and I think every person's experience is going to be different here. But I think from my own experience and the people I talk to, it's a challenge to think about sometimes your faith and how it impacts what you're doing, because there's so many things in front of us, the things we have to get done, tasks we have to complete, problems we have to solve, that sometimes we can forget to reflect on our faith. I don't think that doesn't mean that faith isn't being integrated, because if your faith is central to you, it's shaping your attitudes and your motives, and so it's having an impact there. But I do actually think it's a helpful process to check myself in the morning or when appropriate throughout the day, and just to say, am I doing what I'm doing with the right motives? Am I doing this in a way that honors God, and actually asking for wisdom before I go into a meeting? It's a little bit unique here. Baylor, again, I try to describe that. No one's forced to pray, but it wouldn't be a strange thing for us to pray before an important meeting to ask for wisdom when we're doing strategic planning or talking through some faculty issues. And so I think we're all in a process of journey of learning. Those people who are interested in trying to integrate their faith, and some are maybe farther along than me, which I'm sure there are many. But I'm still working at trying to not only start the day and to live that out with my intentions, but actually kind of remind myself along the way of those resources, of that motivation and sense of satisfaction I can receive if I reflect on my faith during my workday.
What about doing a study of people that are of faith? They're at the workplace, whether it's supportive or not, and how they handle situations that they consider to be, against Christianity's teachings.
Yeah, no, I think there's a range for studies that could happen in that area. I do think, honestly, this culturally as a nation, it might be too simplistic. I'm sure it is to say that we used to be kind of more accepting of Christian cultural norms, and now there's a pushback in certain areas. And I think just as you think about it, like as Europe did this, as they kind of moved away from their faith, they were maybe less friendly to those who wanted to continue to make faith a conversation in the public square. So I think there's actually probably room for trying to understand if people of Christian faith or actually other faiths, a Muslim or any faith, what kind of pushback they get when they do try to integrate their faith. And I'm sure the more explicit you are about it, the more pushback you get. So that's part of our research has found that when you verbalize it, you get more pushback than if you just try to live it out with, a good work ethic and treating other people like you want to be treated, that kind of thing. So there's definitely something we learned about maybe ways that are going to be more receptive to others about living out your faith. And then some of the repercussions for those who do it, even in appropriate and reasonable and gentle ways, like just working hard and trying to love other people like you want to be loved. And sometimes even then you might get some pushback if they know you're coming from a faith perspective. But we'll see. I mean, that's why we do research, trying to figure out as things change, how these kind of different phenomena will play out.
Yeah, I mean, what about, I don't know, something that would help people, again, that are of faith, whatever faith it may be, navigate the workplace in a better way without it causing them spiritual distress?
Right. Actually, there's a fair bit of work around, for example, prayer and the benefits of those who pray. And this is just from a measurement of prayer that you do it, not necessarily measuring, which will be really difficult to do if those prayers are answered, or to what extent prayer evokes a supernatural response. But just the act of praying, we do find, is one of these kind of coping mechanisms that helps people have a more satisfying work experience, as well as helps through a number of difficult situations in terms of health problems and others. So I think there could be ways to expand and should be, ways to expand beyond faith. Look at other ways that maybe we integrate our faith, different kinds of spiritual practices, and how those spiritual practices might impact our ability to handle difficult situations, but also maybe even excel. We did our initial study, it was just very simple. One of our initial studies in this NSF study was just that we found out that entrepreneurs prayed more than people who were in the workplace. And we should have probably dug in a little bit more about that. We asked some questions in those interviews about it, but haven't really written anything up about this. But, what we kind of surmised was when life's uncertain, when you're facing maybe situations where you could lose all the money you invested, or your company might go broke, or you're hard pressed for good ideas to try and grow your company. I mean, people pray, right? They realize they're kind of at the end of their rope. They need to pray, or they're so uncertain they have to pray and ask for kind of the fortitude or insight to keep, moving forward. And so I think that was an interesting finding that we had right off the bat, that some are actually going to feel like some different workplaces are going to actually feel like they need to integrate faith more to get them through the day, get them through difficult situations where maybe other people are going to feel like it doesn't seem as relevant to them. And that's also an area to kind of dig in and do some research.
Well, I guess last thing, how can a workplace support its staff that are of faith without being invasive, without making them feel bad, but supporting them somehow,
right,
the way they want to be?
Absolutely. And this is this idea of faith-friendly workplaces is something that some organizations have gotten some traction on. Like Tyson Foods has tried to not just and this is the actual company that produces from chickens to the grocery store, that kind of work. And some of their jobs aren't very glorious, but they need to get done in order for us to enjoy the chicken we get from the grocery store, right? But how they've tried to figure out, in even contexts like that, how they can allow people to have that expression. Sometimes it is allowing them a place to gather, and it's not mandatory, right? It'd be voluntary, a place for those people to gather, find people of similar faith and be encouraged by that. It might take place in terms of different policies or procedures. And I think as we invite different faiths into the workplace, there's different holidays that people might want to celebrate. And so there might be some policies around like flexibility around scheduling, or flexibility around, when you can take your holidays, some of those things that allow organizations to allow somebody who has a very, kind of important holiday that they'd like to celebrate, that they can take that off somehow. But those are just two quick examples of things that an organization could do just to think about how they might accommodate that interest while still achieving organizational goals. And then, of course, there are going to be maybe requests that they can't be accommodated because of the work of the organization that needs to get done. But I think sometimes organizations are hesitant to ask because they think it's just easier to exclude those kinds of conversations or those kinds of expressions in the workplace. But when they do, then they lose the opportunity maybe to motivate some of their employees, to encourage some of their employees, or even attract some of their employees. And this was one of the attract and retain. And this was actually another study we did. And we did find out that when a founder of an organization was upfront in their desire for their organization, their entrepreneurial endeavor to glorify God, that that made that more attractive for those who had similar values, just kind of like what you said earlier, right? I mean, it really didn't impact very much into those who didn't have those same values. And in fact, it actually probably decreased a little bit the attractiveness of it. But if there's some, if those people who were more attractive because of their faith, they may not have come to that company, if that company wasn't open about what they were doing. But as a result, they were far more motivated to go there as a possible job opportunity. So yes, there could be a, double-edged sword. You could actually attract some people and other people might not want to work there. But I hope that as companies do this, they wouldn't be excluding other people, but they would be trying to figure out ways to include people and welcome people and figure out, how people can feel a sense of belonging in the workplace as they bring their whole self to the workplace.
Well, very good. Mitch, what's the best way for people to learn more about your work and to see the results of some of these studies? Like, where can they go first?
Sure. Well, we tend to, as academics, one of the short, quick ways to do this is kind of go into like Google Scholar and search. You search on my name and you could plug in some of these things like calling or spiritual capital, and some of those articles would pop up. But you could also find me at Baylor. I continue to be involved in these kinds of things. They could drop me an email and I could kind of point them in the right direction if they'd like to. So that'd be great.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a really interesting conversation, and it sounds like there are many more questions to ask and studies to be done. So I look forward to seeing more of your work as it comes.
Absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity to share some thoughts and the work we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.